will talk about photosynthesis today. So let's see. Photosynthesis. Now I would prefer to actually cover photosynthesis first and then do respiration. It just seems to make more sense in my mind, but I follow your book. So I want to start though with a review of this diagram, and you should have this in your notes already. If you don't, you should get it there because this is what I consider the most important diagram of this chapter. And it looks something like this. I drew this before in your notes. This little guy is a chloroplast. So you should have it. I'm just going to draw it again though because I want you to, as we go through this stuff, I want it all to be joined together in your mind. Because that's the way it is in nature. So photosynthesis, the sun shines on a chloroplast. Chloroplasts are green. That's why the leaves are green on that plant, because there's little chloroplasts in there and they're green. Sun shines on a chloroplast, and that energy is used to make sugar and oxygen gas. So it's a good thing for us that there's chloroplasts around, because if there wasn't, we wouldn't have much to breathe. So that's where the oxygen comes. The oxygen that you breathe came from chloroplasts. All right. Now after chloroplasts, after that, it goes into those sugars and the oxygen, both of them. The sugars and the oxygen go into our other little buddy that lives in our cells. That is the what? Mitochondrion. Mitochondrion. All right. Now the mitochondrion makes ATP, right? And the ATP is used to power the cells. We'll say powers most cellular work. Again, I already drew this, but I'm doing it again because it's worth emphasizing. And then also it produces heat as waste. And that's why your body is warm. Right? Your body stays warm because of this process. This is producing heat. I almost called it waste heat, but then I wanted to say it's not really waste. You need to keep warm. So our bodies are kind of using this. You know when you turn the heater on in your car, that it's just extra heat from your engine that's coming into the cabin of the car. You knew that, right? Same kind of idea. The heat that's kind of a waste product is actually used to keep you warm. Unless you have some kind of fancy electric heater or something like that, but most cars don't have that sort of thing. So this comes over here. The waste products of the mitochondria of cellular respiration are CO2 and water. And then those waste products go into the chloroplast to redo the cycle. All right? So in the past, we were down here with respiration. That's what we were talking about on the bottom half of this picture. The bottom half of this picture is respiration. Now we're switching up to the top half to photosynthesis. So respiration was the bottom half, photosynthesis the top half of this drawing. You with me? Now, the equation for photosynthesis is the opposite of respiration. So if you know one, you know the other one, just turn it backwards. It's opposite of respiration. And it looks like this. You're not going to start with glucose this time. Photosynthesis makes glucose. So this time we're going to start with CO2 gas and water. EQN, sorry, it stands for equation. 6 CO2 and 6 H2O makes C6H12O6, which is glucose. You're going to need to write it. Yeah, that's a good question. You should have this equation and respiration memorized so that you could potentially write it down, right? And they're the same thing, only backwards. Just, I suppose, it's easy to get them mixed up, though, and like put oxygen on the wrong side and stuff like that. So just memorize these. I think it helps, so if you just if you understand what is produced by photosynthesis, that you know that photosynthesis makes glucose and that plants make oxygen, then it'll help you to remember what goes on what side. And if you remember that your cells need glucose to burn, right, then you'll remember that glucose goes on the left for respiration. Do you know that plants actually do both photosynthesis and respiration? They need to, because look, photosynthesis makes glucose. It doesn't make ATP. Photosynthesis doesn't produce ATP as a net product at the end. So the plant still needs ATP to power all its proteins and its enzymes and its little pumps and all that kind of stuff. How's it going to get the ATP? It burns the glucose that it makes. See, the only difference between us and plants is that we both do respiration. We both have mitochondria in us, but they don't need to eat glucose. They can make their own. It's pretty cool. So someday we'll have green people that have chloroplasts in their skin, and you won't even have to eat. You'll just be able to just lie out in the sun for a while every day, and you'll be fine. You still have to drink. Okay. This is the equation for photosynthesis, so you should remember that. Now we're going to go in a little bit closer here, okay? And we're going to do a diagram like we did, so make yourself some space. It's going to be a diagram of a chloroplast like this. Yeah, like a whole page. So we're going to make a diagram just like we did for, just like that confusing diagram that I drew for the mitochondria that many of you put on a poster, right? The thing that you guys put on the poster, we're going to do the same thing for photosynthesis. But this thing, instead of being a mitochondrion, is now a chloroplast. And no, I didn't. I still have two posters to grade, actually. This thing is green, but actually, no, that's not the green part. I'm going to show you what the green part is in here. Now, in a chloroplast, you saw the way I just drew it in the last screen, right? You see how I drew these little things right here? Those are called the thylakoid membranes. And they look like a little stack of pancakes, but they're actually membranes, like little rounded membranes that are stacked up, and they're bunch of different stacks in the chloroplast. But I have to draw them really big because I'm going to have to put an electron transport chain in there. One thing you're going to find is that this looks just like respiration. Okay? It's got a membrane with an electron transport chain in it, and it has a cycle over here, just like respiration. Now you might think that's not good because I'm going to get confused, but on the other hand, it is good. Because they both have electron transport chains, and they both have cycles, right? They both basically work the same way. Think about that. So once you kind of get the hang of it, and you start to understand what's going on, the basic idea of electron being carried around, ATP being produced, you got it. Because the same thing happens here too. It's better than having to learn a whole new set of processes all over again, right? Or anew. So I'm going to draw these thylakoid membranes as large, even though they're actually pretty small. Right? This is these are enlarged thylakoid membranes. So let's go ahead and name these thylakoid membranes. Again, membranes are very important. And in this case, they look like this. We've got an electron transport chain that looks actually pretty much the same. Whoops. Remember how I drew that electron transport chain last time? Drew it something like that. is basically in here. Let me find out where it is. Just a second. I should have drawn it on here. I want to put the chlorophyll in the right place, so. Okay, there. The chlorophyll is here, and you're not going to have to memorize this exactly like where everything is, but the chlorophyll is actually a little molecule that's kind of like, it's almost like, think about it like a little antenna sticking off of these proteins. It's a molecule that can absorb light, and it is green actually. If we, next week we'll be extracting the chlorophyll from those leaves, and you'll see like if you boil those leaves in alcohol, and what will happen is the alcohol will turn green, bright green. What it's doing is it's soaking all the chlorophyll out of the leaves. So chlorophyll is green. Now what does that mean? Does it absorb green light, you think, if it's green? Think about this. Chlorophyll's green. Does it absorb green light, or does it reflect green light? It reflects it. It actually absorbs red and blue. Okay? It absorbs everything but green. Now think about this, and this is in your book. On page 87, there's a figure that looks like this. So let's go down here a minute. Sorry, and we'll talk about chlorophyll. Chlorophyll, which is the green stuff. Your book has a graph like this on page 87, and it looks like this. It says absorption. How much light does it absorb? And it has the wavelength of the light. And it goes, down here is the violet, blue, green, yellow. Let me spread this out a little bit, sorry. Violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. The absorption of chlorophyll is mostly like this. So what that means is chlorophyll absorbs blue, mostly blue and red light. And converts it to chemical energy. Chlorophyll is very important. Without it, well, there wouldn't be much life on Earth because of its ability to convert the sun's energy into chemical energy. It's almost like a little solar panel. A solar panel converts the sun's energy from solar into electrical energy. This is going to convert it into chemical energy. The energy is going to be transmitted. It's going to hit the chlorophyll. It's going to go from there to this electron transport chain and end up making ATP at the end. Now this, you guys had IPS, right? So did you talk about light and wavelengths and stuff? Yeah. So we don't need to go into a lot of depth on this, but I do want you to understand this because, like, for example, there's people that sell, have you ever seen this? They sell like this red plastic that you put under tomato plants. Have you ever seen that? They sell, you can buy it online or at the garden store or whatever, this red plastic stuff that you put around the bottom of tomato plants. Now let me ask you this question. Why would people think that would help? Why does that matter? Look at this graph and what I'm saying here. If chlorophyll absorbs mostly red and blue light, then the idea is if I make more red light somehow, then I'll have more energy going into the chlorophyll. You see? Now, I'm not saying it works because the red plastic is really not making more red light. It's only reflecting red light that was already there in the sunshine. Okay? So it's not like it's making more. But they are right about the fact that you wouldn't want to make it green plastic, for example. Because the green plastic is going to absorb red and blue. Greg's sweatshirt. Does it absorb orange light? No. It reflects orange light. It absorbs everything else. Brandon's sweatshirt reflects red. What colors does Seth's sweatshirt absorb? All of them. Why do things that are black get really hot in the sun, like a black car, like a black dashboard in the car? Because it absorbs all the wavelengths. What does it do? What does absorb mean? Remember, energy is always conserved. It doesn't disappear. It goes from one form into another. So when we say absorb, what we mean is it's being transformed into some other form of energy. In this case, heat. That's why that seat in your car that's black gets so darn hot in the summertime. Right? Oh yeah, asphalt's a good example. Asphalt is a really good absorber of sunlight. I mean, it's not only black, it's not shiny, right? It's a dull black. So it really absorbs it. It doesn't reflect hardly anything. So that's chlorophyll. Chlorophyll absorbs the sun's energy. Let's look at what happens next. So now you got to pay close attention because it gets a little bit complicated here. Okay, we're going to go in steps. The sunlight comes into the chlorophyll, and like I said, the good thing about this is it looks a lot like respiration. It's basically respiration in reverse. So the first thing that's going to happen is right here, we're going to take a water molecule and we're going to split it into oxygen and H+ ions. Now, that is exactly the opposite of respiration. At the electron transport chain in respiration, we were making water at the end of it. Do you remember that? We made a water molecule from oxygen and hydrogen in the electron transport chain at the end of it. In this one, it's the opposite. Now, what else do you think's happening here? Just like it's backwards from respiration. An electron comes out of this. Electron comes out of that into this thing, which is the electron transport chain. Let me just write down here. This is the electron transport chain. It is not exactly the same. It's not built of the same molecules as in respiration, but it's the same basic idea. In fact, I think there's still the same number of proteins. There's 5, just like in respiration. So it's this is all very similar. Maybe it's because mitochondria and chloroplasts actually have like a common ancestor that had the electron transport chain, and then they just became a little bit different. I don't know. So the electron comes down, and then just like before, the electron is going to go through the transport chain and come out the other side. That happened in respiration. Now, because that electron's coming out the other side, you got to ask the question, something's got to pick it up over there. And surprise, surprise, it's going to be an electron carrier. Unfortunately, the electron carrier is a little confusing because it looks a lot like the one in respiration, but it's not exactly the same. What's different? The P at the end. In respiration, it was NAD. In photosynthesis, NADP. Now, I would not be so cruel on a test as to give you both of those options and ask you which is the electron carrier in photosynthesis. Because they're very close. NAD is for respiration, NADP is for photosynthesis.
Wouldn't you just remember that NADP is P?
You could, yeah. That's a good way to. That's a good thought. You can say. Did you hear what Seth said? He said you can remember P for photosynthesis, so put a P on the end of NAD. But I'm not going to actually require you to know that. Now, this is the thing. It picks up a hydrogen ion and an electron. So this is our electron carrier. Now, photosynthesis is kind of nice because there's no other electron carrier. There's no FAD thing to worry about. Just got one, NADP, NADPH, electron carrier. All right. Now, what are we missing here? We're missing some ATP. Now, look at this. Oh, we're missing the cycle too. Yeah, we're going to get to that. But even over here, I forgot to draw something in, and it looks like this. Just like before, it's a little pump. The hydrogen ions go down through the pump, just like they did in respiration. They run the pump. Now think about this. Have you guys ever seen a water wheel? Like at Sturbridge Village or whatever? Water goes in over the wheel, and what does it do? It does work. The wheel turns, and the wheel does something. It grinds grain, or it runs a saw, whatever it is. In this case, hydrogen ions go through the wheel. The wheel literally does turn. That molecule, if you could watch that thing, you would see it rotating around every time a proton came through. It would go click, 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 like that. And as it's turning around, somehow it is making ATP out of ADP. So it's making ATP. And now we're done with that part. And by the way, this whole half of the diagram, these are the so-called light reactions because they require light. They only happen when there's light shining on them. You notice I have all those lights shining on that plant? That's because it's this time of year especially, very little light's actually coming through that window, so the plant won't do much without extra light on it. So up till now, it's really, I think maybe it makes it a little tough, the fact that it's so similar to respiration. But on the other hand, there's so many things that are the same. They both have electron transport chains. They both make an ATP.
But there are a lot of, like, as similar as they are, there are a lot of, like, noticeable differences.
Yeah, there are a lot of small differences.
Chain, that's such a dead giveaway that it's not, that they're different. So if
Why?
you just memorize which one's is circular, right?
Circular, what do you mean?
Like the electron transport chain, the 3 circles you have over there.
Yep, these right here. You mean this part?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's different then.
It looks similar. And it also, the electrons flow through. Now think about this, just to remind you, if this were respiration, what would be happening? You'd have an electron carrier dumping an electron into the transport chain. The electron would go through, pump hydrogen ions across, and then come out and be accepted by water. This is exact opposite. The electron comes from water and ends up in NADPH. Now, one thing I didn't show you is there are hydrogen ions being pumped across here by the transport chain, just like in photosynthesis. Okay, now the cycle. So just like in respiration, we have a cycle. And the cycle is just a series of chemical reactions. Your book goes into quite a bit of detail on this. Don't worry about the different compounds inside the cycle. There's like 3GP and PGA and NBA and NCAA and who knows what else. Okay? Don't worry about all those different compounds that are in there. Okay? What is this called? This has a different name. It's not. What's the one called in respiration? Krebs. Sometimes it's called citric acid cycle. This one is called Calvin.
What? Did they argue over everything?
Calvin was just the name of the guy who discovered it, just like Krebs. Not discovered it, but what they did is they did all this research to figure out all the steps that are actually happening in all the different compounds. So that's Calvin cycle. Now, here we go. Let's look at what goes into the cycle. This is actually much simpler. It's kind of nice. The cycle's a lot simpler. Into the cycle come 2 things, CO2 and H2O. That's not surprising because remember this equation? CO2 and H2O, that's what goes into photosynthesis, right? CO2 and H2O go in, And what comes out of the Calvin cycle is glucose. All right? C6H12O6. Now, the only other thing I need to show is that we have to get ATPs in here. Now, this is where there's a distinct difference here between the, let me do this. That's handy. There's a distinct difference between this and respiration in the cycle. In the Krebs cycle, ATP is produced. In the Calvin cycle, it is consumed. Now, hang on.
That sounds horrible.
Listen. In the Calvin cycle, ATP is actually used up. Photosynthesis as a whole, the chloroplast, actually does not make ATP. It doesn't have a net product of a bunch of ATP molecules. It makes ATP over here, but that ATP is used up here. Okay? It makes ATP here, but that's only so that it can make glucose. Now that makes sense. Listen. It takes ATP to make glucose. When you break glucose, what do you get? ATP. All right? It requires ATP to make it. When you break it apart, when you break it down in respiration, that makes ATP. Back and forth. That's why I started with that cycle. This is like, it's the same thing only in reverse with different names for some of the things. And that is, well, that's basically the overview of photosynthesis right there.
Shortest lecture ever.
Well, hang on, before we get done. Just a couple of points I want to make.
I know.
You should study this diagram. Once again, what I plan to do on the test is give you a diagram like this with some blanks in it, and you have to fill in the blanks. Or you have to tell me what names go in the blanks. What are some other types of questions? I might say, which of the following is an electron carrier?
Oh, you're
And then I might say something like this, ADP, NAD, and stuff like that. You see what I'm saying?
NAD is what
So I'll give you things like that. So I'm looking for the conceptual level. I will not require you to redraw this whole thing.
okay, I wouldn't do it.
I might ask you something like this. I might say this would be a tough one. I might say, where do the electrons come from for photosynthesis in the electron transport chain? And you'd have to say water. That would be a tough one.
Whoa, wait, it comes what?
It comes from water right here.
That makes sense. I see that right there.
Now, one of the interesting things about photosynthesis is that water is actually required at two places.
I know.
If you think about it, if you think about respiration, that wasn't really true. Like, water only showed up in one place, CO2 only showed up in one place, oxygen only showed up in one place. But here you got water. Let's, before we finish, let's just point out some other differences. Anybody want to see any other differences we can point out between this and respiration? I mean, other than the obvious, like CO2 is going in instead of coming out of the cycle. Again, it's just backwards, right? I didn't emphasize this, that just like in respiration, the electron transport chain, its job is actually to pump electrons across hydrogen ions across the membrane. You set up a concentration gradient, and then they diffuse back through, but they go through the pump. And it's kind of weird when you think about it, but it's very like machine-like. You're basically pumping things across, and then you let them flow back through, and when they come back through, they run a little machine that makes ATP. That's literally how it works. Then the ATP is fuel for the Calvin cycle. So it comes over here and runs the cycle around and around and around, and actually it takes 6 times around to make 1 glucose molecule. And that's photosynthesis. And let's just say one more thing after this. The glucose in plants the glucose produced is often stored as a polymer. A prize to the person who can tell me what that polymer of glucose is called.
Glucose polymer.
That's wrong.
Nectar.
It is a carbohydrate, that's good, but let's get more specific.
Maple syrup.
What?
Maple syrup is actually just mostly simple sugars like glucose and sucrose and
It's a
stuff
good
like that.
guess, right?
Polymer called. No, you know, actually, when you think of maple syrup, that's the sap of the tree, right? Why is it sweet? Because it's all that glucose that's in there. You're right. Some trees do store it as just sugars.
So was I right?
No.
Get a prize?
That's not what I was looking for. That's not for the prize. It's some other word that is a polymer of glucose that's in foods.
Sugar?
It is a carbohydrate,
What's
but
it
it's a
start with?
there's different kinds of carbohydrates.
Oh, what's it start with?
Fat.
What is sugar?
The person who gets it right gets a star card.
Yeast.
And then you can.
Starch?
Who said that? Very good. Very good. Starch. That's why so many vegetables have starch in them, right? Potatoes. That's why there's starch in wheat, right?
I said
And beans and all that stuff. They all have starch. They're all starchy foods. Why? Because the plant is storing the glucose that it makes. Why would it want to store it? Well, let's say it's dark out, right? It's got to have glucose stored. Let's say it's a cloudy day. It's got to have stored glucose, right? So it has to store it. And it stores it as starch. Now, before, oh, I didn't write down the answer. Let me just stop this thing here for a second. The reason I ended on that is because we're gonna do a little lab where we're gonna use that